Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you. Appreciate that. First, let me thank you for all being here and answering the call to join the Catholic faith. I know it takes courage, but it takes much grace and blessings to do that, so thank you very much for that. As Deacon Frank said, my name is Deacon Scott Lancaster. I am married. I've been married for over 37 years. I don't know how that happened. We have 3 grown children. They're all married, all off the payroll. The last one got married in November, so that was, you can check that box. We've also been blessed with 2 grandchildren. We just had our 2nd grandchild 3 weeks ago, and so that's always very exciting. A little girl, Olivia Claire. And having both children and grandchildren are great. You get to go home without them. My wife and I have been parishioners here at St. Louis for 32 years. As soon as we moved to Howard County, we joined the parish here. Felt that it was very, the liveliness of the spirit here just struck us very strongly, and we came here and we never left, so it's a great place to be. I've also been a deacon for almost 12 years, and I've served that entire time here at St. Louis, and additionally with St. Francis when they joined us as a pastorate. My wife and I are also charged with coordinating marriage preparation for this pastorate, and so part of my talk tonight is going to incorporate some of that, I think. I'm hoping to make this very interactive, and so if you have questions, please ask them as they come up, because that way they're in context of what we're talking about, if that makes any sense. But if you're more comfortable, I'll allow some time at the end to do that as well. Okay? Very good? It was pretty underwhelming. All right. So, if we think about marriage in today's society, when do you think marriage, Catholic Christian marriage, was established?
Wedding Feast of Cana?
No, earlier than that, said in Cana, wedding feast. If you go back to the book of Genesis, that was a little before that. If you go back to the book of Genesis, what did God? One of the first things God did was to do what? He created
Man and woman.
Man and woman, right? And why did he do that? He had nothing better to do. It seemed like the thing to do.
Yeah.
Well, he created man and then realized that man was alone. He created us in his image. And as such, we're created to be in community. We're not made to be alone. And so when he created man, he created woman so that they could be a partnership in the world. And what did he tell them to do? He created them. He said God created man in his own image. He created them male and female. He created them. And then what did he do? God blessed them. He blessed their union. And then he said, be fruitful and multiply. He brought them together as he unioned them. He blessed that relationship. And then he said, go be fruitful and multiply. He did it. He asked them to be fruitful and multiply after he brought them together. And he said, fill the earth and subdue it, meaning that the human race was to use the world. Okay? That foundation was created millennia ago, multiple millennia ago. And for millennia, it has been the foundation of society. It made society work. Would you agree? Okay? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So for generations, that joining of a man and a woman was the basis for marriage. In that relationship, it reflects, or should reflect divinely, the same love that God has for each one of us. God does not conditionally love you, right? There's nothing you can do to cause God not to love you. It's unconditional. And he designed marriage to reflect that same love. That the love between a man and a woman in the sacrament of marriage is unconditional. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. All right? So if it's unconditional, then he created us to participate in the creation process in marriage. Okay? Think about that. He gave us a gift that allows us to be co-creators with him. And that's what he asked us to do way back in Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. That's why the conjugal act in marriage should reflect the unconditional love that a man and a woman have for one another. Think about it. If the conjugal act is just an act of love, right, then it's really no different than the other animals in the world. What Jesus commands us and God commands us is that the conjugal act, that gift, should be in the spirit of love. And in that should be the giving of oneself totally to the other. Does that make sense? And if it's not, and it can't be that way outside of marriage, that's why the church teaches that sex is meant for marriage, is because you can't do it outside of marriage and have it be unconditional. It just can't happen because you've placed a condition on it. Because you can walk away from it. Does that make sense? Okay? So like God's love, married love is the gift of one's whole life, unconditional, for the whole of life. Because if it's not for the whole of life, that's a condition. If you walk away from it, you've conditioned it. Does that make sense? Right, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Another model of marital love is called Trinitarian love. Another way of looking at the Trinity is to say you have God the Father, you have God the Son. Do they love one another? Unconditionally. They would never walk away from it. If they were to walk away from it, the love would die. It would be suicidal. And so one model says that the love the Father has for the Son, the love the Son has for the Father, is the Holy Spirit. And they would no more walk away from that and cause the death of the Holy Spirit than you or I would wish that on our child. Does that make sense? Okay? Like I mentioned, I've been married for 37 years. We have 3 children. It wasn't until, I didn't know this when I got married. I had no idea. But when I reflect back on our children and the unconditional love that I have for my 3 children, there's nothing they can do that would make me not love them. Now, they've pissed me off a few times, but I still love them unconditionally. And in reflecting back on that through the lens of life, the wisdom one gets from looking through the lens of life, I've come to realize that marital love is the exact same thing. That there's nothing my wife could do that would make me not love her. And she's pissed me off a few times. Just like I'm sure I've pissed her, so don't think I'm no saint, trust me. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because that love's unconditional. And if I were to break it, it would be suicidal. I would die. Not physically, but spiritually. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a view on what Catholic Christian marriage looks like. Let's look at a secular, if you view marriage from a secular point of view. There's a lot of confusion in the world today about what marriage is. Why do you think that is?
Different norms.
I'm sorry?
Different norms.
What do you mean?
What people have kind of established to be like, this is okay, or like within my relationship, like we're okay with this.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, exactly. So like instead of like, well, God said this is how it should be, but we're okay with doing it this way, like you're putting your own conditions on it.
So in that light then, who in a secular view of marriage, who created marriage? Did God? Or did man? Man created marriage. And if man created marriage, man can change marriage. And that's what we're seeing today, is that man, and I don't mean man, I mean humans, we have changed the view of marriage from being God-centered. God created it, therefore we cannot change it, because this is how he created it. If we were to say we can change it, we're saying God was wrong. And that can't be right, right? Whereas man is saying, okay, it's all about me, therefore I can define it however I want to define it. Whether that's between a man and a woman and a woman, if it's between a man and 5 women or 5 men, and however you want to define it, you can, because we created it, and therefore we can change it. That is not a Christ-centered, God-centered way of looking at marriage. If you think about that too, that places a lot of conditions on it, and in my view, it takes a outward-focused relationship, because that's what sacrificial love is, right? You're sacrificing self for the other. And what does it do with that focus? It turns it inwardly, which is not self-sacrificial, it's self-inhibiting. It helps the self. It's sacrificing the other. It rejects the natural law of marriage, which was God's law. Does that make sense? I believe that's why we are where we are today in many respects. It's because we've redefined marriage away from how God defined it, which was sacrificial, unconditional, love-centered, to being selfish, self-centered, unloving, or conditional love. All right? So I think we've rejected the view God had for marriage as established way back in the book of Genesis. Okay? Another thing I found helpful to view this, I'm a teacher by trade, so I love to draw on the board, is if we look at a Catholic, and I've never been accused of having good handwriting, so if you can't read something, you're going to know. Versus a secular marriage. You know, if you look at there's like 3 characteristics of a Catholic Christian marriage, right? The first is the man and the woman are equal in value. That's not saying they are equal, but they're equal in value. They're peers with one another, okay? Whereas in a secular, it's chauvinistic. Should I spell it right? It has chauvinism in it. What does that mean? Are only males chauvinistic?
No.
Are can women be? Chauvinistic just means one of the two has greater value. And that manifests itself many times just in selfishness, being uncompromising, my way or the highway. And that can go either way, either partner, okay? But in a Christian Catholic marriage, because both are in it unconditionally and are giving of themselves wholly, both have to be equal in value. All right? The second thing is, complementary in purpose. Are men and women the same? They're similar, but they're not the same, right? Particularly when you look at the gift as co-creator with God, is the purpose of the male and the female is complementary. You can't create life without one or the other. So they're complementary in purpose, right? Whereas in a secular marriage, we're saying we can be whatever we want, right? There is no, one of the sexes is better than the other. Or, not better than the other, sorry. The sexes are the same. There's no difference between a male and a female. We know physically that's not true. If it were true, there would be no life, okay? So therefore, if they're the same, we can be both, we can be neither, we can be whatever we want. Okay? And then the third thing is, which is similar, which I already said this, skip it. Right? We are different in nature, but complementary in purpose. Does that make sense? Right? Whereas under secular, the sexes are the same, and we're all about the individual. I think if you look at these, can you see that this is outwardly sacrificial focus, right? Everybody, we're both the same. Although we're different, we're complementary in purpose, and in marriage, we want to unconditionally give of one to the other. Whereas in a secular marriage, that's not the case. That you can, one of the parties in the marriage has more value, or everybody's the same. That's what the secular world wants you to believe that. That's why it's okay to have males marry males, females marry females. And it's all about the individual. It's not sacrificial. Does that make sense? So as God defined marriage, he wants us to participate in his life creation in the world, and to do that in the sacrament of marriage, as he defined it back in the book of Genesis. One woman, one man. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, so what I thought would be helpful, maybe, is to look at the actual rite of marriage, because it helps understand this a little better, I think. All right? In the rite of marriage, it starts off just like any Mass would start. You've talked about Mass. Have you talked about Mass yet?
We haven't talked about the parts of the Mass yet.
Okay. So, the first part of the Mass is called the Liturgy of the Word. Have you all been to Mass? Right. So, the very first part of Mass is there are readings, there's a homily. The same thing happens in the marriage rite. Right? What's different, though, happens after the homily, when the couple is invited to come up and stand in front of the congregation. Marriages are a public rite. Right? In fact, there has to be 3 parties at a marriage, a Catholic marriage. There has to be, obviously, the bride and groom. There has to be a member of the church, either a priest or a deacon or a bishop. And then there has to be the community. Because marriage is meant to be public. That's why God created us, to be part of that community as a couple. Does that make sense? All right? And so, that's why it's done in public. It starts with Liturgy of the Word. And then the couple does something very interesting. They're actually the ministers of the sacrament. It's the only sacrament where they're the ministers. They confer the sacrament to one another, as opposed to the priest or deacon baptizing a child. They actually confer it themselves. And the very first thing they have to do is they have to stand in front of the congregation, and they have to answer 3 questions in the affirmative. Okay? The first question is, I'll read it to you. Have you come here to enter into marriage without coercion, freely and wholeheartedly? What do you think that's addressing? Have you come here freely, without coercion, and with your whole heart?
Shotgun.
Pardon?
Shotgun weddings.
Forced marriage.
Well, God created marriage to be a fount of unconditional love. The total giving of one to the other. Have you come here freely and wholeheartedly? No one's forcing you to be here. What does that mean? It's unconditional. If you say, I'll marry you, Joe, if you lose 40 pounds, have you come here freely? Without coercion. It's a condition. You've placed a condition. Right? I've known people that say, look, we're not going to get married until you pay off your student loans. That's a condition. You haven't come here freely. Okay? That's what it means to be unconditional. And both couples, the couple individually have to agree to that. So publicly they state, I have come here freely, wholeheartedly, without coercion. Number 1. Number 2, Are you prepared, as you follow the path of marriage, to love and honor each other for as long as you both shall live? As I was saying, if you enter into the marriage unconditionally, which means you love the other one wholeheartedly, are you able to walk away from that? The church says no. It's God created. You can't walk away from that. It would be suicide. And so the couple has to then state publicly that not only am I here unconditionally, but I understand it's for life. I'm giving my whole self for my whole life. That's what that means. Okay? The third condition is, if it's unconditional and for life, it has to be life-giving. Right? If you enter this as God intended, then you get to participate in the creation of life. You can't do that if you don't have children. And so the third question is, are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and to prepare and to bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? Will you have children? Are you open to life? And if so, when you have children, will you bring them up as Christ's children? All right? So those three conditions, or those three questions are asked of the couple before they even give their consent. And if they say no to any of those, there's no marriage. Right? Now, as an aside, the very first wedding I did after I was ordained, part of the preparation, I'll talk about this in a second, is to ask them, hey, are you open to having children? And the couple said no. Well, it being my first time, I was like, what? What do you mean no? So you have to then delve into that. Like, what exactly does that mean to you? They say, well, we're busy in our careers. We might get to it eventually. I said, well, what if you get pregnant today? What's going to happen? When you're married, what's going to happen? And they said, well, we'd have the child. So they were open to life, just not like the second, right as soon as they were married. So you just have to talk through that. But it's important, as a sign of that unconditional love, that you're open to the gift of life. That makes it unconditional. Okay? Does that make sense? Once you answer those questions, it is then when they exchange the vows. That's called the consent. Right? And you've heard these before, right? You've all been to a wedding. I, Joe, take you, Sally, to be my wife. I promise to be faithful to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health. Love, marital love, is not a feeling. Right? If it was, none of us would be married, because there's some really bad days. I'm just being realistic, right? But we get through that. Why? Because we've made that consent, we've made that agreement to enter into it unconditionally. Nothing you can do will make me not love you. Nothing, right? In the good times and the bad, healthness and sickness. And I'm going to love you and honor you all the days of my life. That's the consent. And in fact, it's not until the marriage, these vows are exchanged, and the marriage is consummated, that meaning that they've had the opportunity to be open to life. The marriage is not valid. You're not married until that happens. So you have to live as husband and wife. We talk about sacraments that matter in form, matter being the sign or symbol, form being the words. Every sacrament has them. For example, in baptism, what's the symbol? You had baptism already, yeah?
Yes.
So what's the symbol of baptism? The matter? The water. What's the form? The words. I baptize you in the name of the Father. So in marriage, the form is the exchange of vows by the couple, so they're exchanging the vows. And what's the matter? That they live as husband and wife. Okay? That's the sign, that's the symbol. That make sense? Now, I often, when I'm the officiant at a marriage, I often talk about what does marital love look like? And to me, it's in a way, it's pretty simple to look at it. All you have to do is look at the cross, right? and you look at Jesus Christ, he got up on that cross. He never asked us, look, if I get up on that cross, will you do this? He never asked that. He just says, I'm going to get up on that cross. You know why? Because I love you. We sometimes get trapped as humans in a negotiation, in a compromise with another. I'm an accountant by trade. I know about business. In business, we negotiate. And in negotiations, you end up compromising, right? That isn't what marriage is all about, because when you negotiate and you compromise, each party gets something, right? I give you this, I get that. I think it's funny there's no cross in here. If you look at the cross, Jesus never did that. He never negotiated. I'm pointing over here because there should be a cross right there. He never negotiated. He just said, I'm going to do it because I love you. That's the same model of love, of marital love, is that no matter what, I'll do it because I love you, not to get love in return. Okay? All right. I just want to talk briefly about the indissolubility of marriage. The reason the Catholic Church, what the Catholic Church teaches is that it has no power to dissolve marriage. You know why? Because God created it, right? And Jesus confirmed it. In Genesis, he brought the two together. Jesus said, what God has put together, let no man put asunder. We don't have the power to dissolve that bond. Other churches think they do, which is kind of interesting because that means they have the power of God, if you believe God put marriage together. I'm just trying to catch up here. So, when we talk about marital love, I think the word love, the problem with our English language is the word love has very many meanings, doesn't it? I can love my cat. I can love bacon. Right? That love is different than the love I have for my siblings, which is different than the love that I have for my children, which is different than the love that I have for my wife. I think we, as a church, believe that the love in marriage is not that, it's a choice we make to enter into that relationship unconditionally. That's the love of marriage. And so when we choose to do that unconditionally, we can't walk away from it, and the church acknowledges that and says we don't have the power to dissolve it. Right? So from the view of the church, divorce isn't a thing. Now, having said all of that, there is the annulment process. I don't know if you've talked about that at all. And you're lucky that Deacon Frank is our annulment expert. What an annulment means, the church looks at a marriage from a tribunal point of view, somewhat, I think, legalistically, and says they're not giving you a divorce. What they're saying is that that marriage never existed in the first place. Because, for example, someone entered it, made a consent, and didn't have the ability to. Didn't understand what it meant to enter into the marriage unconditionally for life. Right? Does that make sense? So one of those three conditions that I talked about, that the church can determine that that never existed, therefore the marriage never existed. Now that doesn't mean if there's children involved, they can still be baptized. They're God's children. Right? What they're saying is that marital relationship never existed. And that's what the annulment process is.
The bond never really happened.
Yeah, the bond never happened. Okay? So, I think it's important to understand. If you have questions about that, I'd be happy to talk about it. Frank can talk about it as well. The last thing I wanted to talk about was marriage prep for Catholics. There's probably a 2 or 3 step process that you have to go through. Number one is you have to meet with a member of the clergy, either the priest, deacon, or bishop. They'll do what's known as a prenuptial investigation. And the point of that is to find out if there are any impediments to you entering into the marriage bond. And so are you unable to enter into a marriage? Like I always ask my couples, are you placing any conditions on this? In other words, are you saying, if you quit smoking, I'll marry you? That's a condition, right? And then we have to talk through all that. No, we don't want to have children. Right? I've had several couples say that. So you have to talk all through that to make sure there's no impediments or reasons why you shouldn't get married. Does that make sense? There's also a pre-Cana or marriage prep course you have to take. It's interesting. I think most couples get a lot out of it. They get something out of it, I should say. Because we cover topics like we cover communication, how to resolve conflict, finances. You'd be surprised at how many couples don't talk about finances before they're married. We talk about spirituality. What does it mean to be a Catholic couple? And then finally, we talk about intimacy. Now, you may wonder what a 61, 62-year-old deacon can talk about intimacy. But what we talk about is not necessarily physical intimacy. I think we all understand that. That's natural. But physical intimacy is just that, unless it also has spiritual intimacy. We all want to be known. Are we open to being known by our spouse? That's, to me, is part of that unconditional surrender to the other person. So it's not about physical intimacy, it's about spiritual intimacy, okay? So all of that gets covered in our pre-Cana course. There are other options. You can meet with sponsor couples. We also go use a program. You've heard of Dynamic Catholic, Matthew Kelly. He has a great program called Better Together that we also use in our marriage prep. It's video-based. It's actually quite good. It's free. So if you go to Dynamic Catholic, you can actually find it yourself if you're interested. Maybe you're looking for something to do tomorrow night.